Well, welcome back to our motor learning class, and we're in chapter 3 now, and we're going to look at motor abilities with the idea of what are the underlying motor abilities that will help you be successful in motor skill acquisition and performance. So as we look at motor abilities, first of all, let's define motor abilities. An ability is just the general capacity, the underlying potential you have to be successful at some skill. When we talk about motor abilities, then it specifically relates to being successful in motor skill acquisition and performance. So the idea that you have underlying um, general traits, enduring dispositions of these qualities, these abilities, specifically in the area of motor ability, that will help you be successful in motor skill acquisition and performance. So motor abilities we're born with. We have underlying potential, and then depending how we develop that potential. So we see it as these enduring qualities that kind of is the blueprint or the potential for being successful with various motor skills. And every motor skill has underlying motor abilities that would be necessary to have in order to be successful to perform it. As we talk about motor abilities, there's something just to consider. Let's say you have two people. They have the same amount of practice. They have the same level of motivation, instruction, quality of instruction. Everything's the same. Then it will be the individual that has the greater underlying motor ability that will be more successful. So it's the motor abilities that influence the success each individual will achieve. Again, everything else being equal. There's two hypotheses out there. First, called the general motor hypothesis, which basically says that our motor abilities are highly related to one another and can be grouped together as one singular global motor ability. The other hypothesis is called the specificity of motor ability hypothesis. And this is the idea that motor abilities are relatively independent of one another. So general motor ability, all motor abilities are highly related. A person can be described as having an overall general motor ability. This would be an example of this might be the all-around athlete. They're successful in whatever sport they are involved in because they have this general underlying motor ability. The specificity hypothesis is the idea that these motor abilities are not one general global characteristic, but rather they're very independent of one another. And each individual varies in the amount of each of these motor abilities. So we can think of a person's motor ability as being a profile of varying degrees or varying amounts of each specific motor ability. So right now, if you had to choose between the general motor hypothesis and the specific motor hypothesis, which one would you choose? You believe in the overall global capacity, the all-around athlete, or would you lean more towards the specificity of motor abilities as relates to each motor skill has underlying abilities that are independent to one another? Again, you might have your own general feelings here, but let's see what the research supports. The research does support the specificity hypothesis. As they've done correlational studies between different motor abilities, they have found that those correlations are not high. In fact, in many cases, they have very little relationship one to the other. And so I'm just going to share a few studies with you. One was a study that was done by Henry and his colleagues in the 1960s that looked at reaction time and movement time. And as you remember from our last chapter, we looked at reaction time and movement time. In his research, he did find that reaction time and movement time are two different motor abilities, and they are low in correlation, so they're independent of one another. So someone might have very high reaction time and very slow movement time, or vice versa. Or they may have the same amount, but that's based on their individual underlying motor ability. There's also been recent research that looks at motor ability being specific, and balance is one area. When we look at balance, we can talk about static balance, which is just stationary type of balance, like standing, doing a stork stand, or dynamic balance, where you need balance moving from place to place. And in the research, they found that, in fact, Rose, along with colleagues, found that children that had CP showed balance problems while walking, dynamic balance, but when they were just standing, they did not have balance problems. So again, demonstrating that you are dealing with two different underlying motor abilities. And then a very extensive study by Derwaki and Zuccato in 1967, and they looked at several different types of balance, both static and dynamic, and to see how they related to one another. And you could check that table out in your textbook, table 3.1. But the final results showed that there were very low correlations between static balance and dynamic balance. So again, supporting the idea of motor abilities are specific and independent of one another. So the conclusions again, static and dynamic balance are distinct independent abilities. And as a motor ability, balance can be seen as multidimensional. One more study as it dealt with timing that supported the specificity principle. When we talk about timing, we talk about external or internal. An example of external timing might be like waiting to hit a baseball that's pitched at you. You're anticipating it, you're waiting, and then you have really good timing and you make good contact. That would be considered external timing. Internal timing is within yourself. It's like self-pacing. A golf swing would be an example of internal timing. Think of yourself, you're controlling your own timing from within. And again, the research out there has demonstrated that these are two separate motor abilities. They are not related to one another. And you can read more about those experiments in your textbook. So the research is pretty clear that motor abilities are not one global, broad, general ability, but rather motor ability is made up of, in fact, many different abilities that are relatively independent of one another, and a person may have varying degrees of potential in the various motor abilities. So let's just look at some of these specific motor abilities as we finish up this chapter. One example of an attempt to identify various motor abilities was a guy named Fleshman, and he actually described 11 different perceptual motor abilities, and then he also demonstrated some physical motor abilities. So let's look first of all at his physical proficiency abilities, and then we'll go to his perceptual motor abilities. When we look at the physical proficiency abilities, again, in Fleshman, he's been around for a while, these abilities that he's identified. So as we go through these, you might recognize them from maybe conditioning and fitness class where you talked about different aspects of physical fitness. But you'll see some similarities, I think, with his physical proficiency abilities. He talks about static strength, dynamic strength, explosive strength, trunk strength, extent flexibility, dynamic flexibility, gross body coordination, and gross body equilibrium. These would all be considered physical proficiency abilities. So having underlying these specific abilities will help you be successful in some types of motor skills. Last one, stamina. I think stamina, we might call it now cardiovascular endurance. But again, these are all necessary in order to be able to perform various motor skills. Physical proficiency abilities. Then his other category would be called perceptual motor abilities. And again, in the textbook, each one of these you can read through, see examples of, and see the definition for. Multi-limb coordination, control precision, response orientation, reaction time, the speed of the limb movement, rate control, manual dexterity, finger dexterity, arm hand steadiness, wrist finger speed, and aiming. Again, go to the textbook, read through the definitions, look at the different examples given. So let's take a motor skill and see how this all fits together. First of all, I'm just going to use the tennis serve, okay? And when we break down a tennis serve, we call that a skill analysis, where we break it down into parts. We're going to break it into the components of the skill, and then take another step and look at the underlying motor abilities that would be necessary in order to perform that part of the skill. Okay, so again, hopefully most of you are familiar with tennis, and let's look at the tennis serve. So if we did a skill analysis for the tennis serve, we would break it down into the grip, the stance, the ball toss, the backswing, the forward swing, making contact with the ball, and the follow through. That's a pretty good overview. Well, then we would then go to the underlying necessary motor abilities that we would need in order to perform the tennis serve. And so, again, going to Fleischmann's different motor abilities that he's defined, some examples would be, in order to do a good tennis serve, you need to have multi-limb coordination. You got to toss with one hand, hit the tennis ball with the other. Control precision. You have to have a good control toss. The speed of your arm movement, your rate control, how you aim. You're going to need some static strength. There may be some few others there. And so what I would like you to do now is a similar activity where you would select a motor skill. You can select any motor skill you'd like. Then complete a task analysis of that skill. Break it down into parts, and then identifying the underlying motor abilities necessary to perform the parts of the skill. And when you finish that, just turn that in as a homework assignment. And if you have any questions, just let me know.